again. I'd also like to thank Alice and Bill Flynn for really quite spectacular overnight accommodations for myself and my wife, Jenna. And most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here instead of being out on the beach with such a wonderful day that it is. Well, I'm very happy to announce the joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula tonight. I'm going to give you the terms. The terms include neither Korea, neither North nor South, will test, manufacture, possess, deploy, or use nuclear weapons. Neither North nor South Korea will possess reprocessing facilities or uranium enrichment facilities. And both Koreas agreed to inspection and verification measures. And you probably are scratching your head by now saying, wait a minute, Trump and Kim just had their summit, all the details remain to be worked out. How can I possibly be announcing the joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Yet I am, because this declaration was signed on January 20th, 1992. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight is how we got to that 1992 agreement, and in particular, what has happened since, and is there any prospect, or even should there be any prospect, of a return to the terms that were signed over 30 years ago. And the place to begin, and where I'll pass over rather rapidly, is the origins of the Korean problem to begin with. They began with Japan, an area of my own interest, and the problem was that Japan surrendered too soon to end the Second World War. American planners, among others, had not anticipated such a rapid Japanese surrender. The plans for the occupation of Japanese territories, most particularly Korea, had not been finalized at the time of Japan's surrender. A very hasty division based, believe it or not, on a map drawn from National Geographic magazine was basically sliced the Korean Peninsula in half between the northern part, where the Soviet Union accepted Japan's surrender, and the southern part, where the United States did. And that has led to endless complications since. The Republic of Korea, otherwise known as South Korea, was established in May of 1948 with a man called Syngman Rhee at its head under the auspices of the United Nations. But the Korean communists under Kim Il-sung, the current leader's grandfather, refused to recognize the validity of the Syngman Rhee regime. There were wide insurrections in South Korea against the Syngman Rhee regime and a rival government established in North Korea against Syngman Rhee. Both governments in North and South claimed jurisdiction over the entire country. American forces left in June of 1949. Soviet forces had left the North well before then. The Americans essentially declared that South Korea was not a matter of immediate priority for American defense policies, but it certainly was a priority for Kim Il-sung, who was the communist leader of the North. And with Soviet and Chinese approval, we know now from looking at the Soviet and Chinese archives, Kim Il-sung and North Korea attacked the South in June of 1950 and began what we call the Korean War. After repelling the initial North Korean attack, American-led UN forces drove into the north, virtually to the Yalu River, the border with communist China, prompting Chinese intervention in November of 1950, a very bloody war between Chinese and US-led UN forces thereafter, and eventually a truce that was signed in June of 1953 between the United States, North Korea, and China. And you'll notice that a party is not included in those talks, South Korea, which did not sign the truce in 1953. Indeed, Syngman Rhee threatened to continue the Korean War on his own and was persuaded not to do so only when then President Dwight Eisenhower offered South Korea a mutual defense treaty, still in effect, substantial economic system, which gradually petered out by the 1970s, and a promise that the United States would support the eventual reunification of Korea, a promise that is still technically on the books. There were no major changes in the Korean situation until the late 1960s, when a series of Cold War crises increased American friction. But what I want to emphasize here is they increased American friction with South Korea, not the North. That might sound strange, since the first example I'm going to give comes from January of 1968, when the North Koreans seized an American warship, USS Pueblo. And that's fairly well known in the history of American foreign relations. What is not so well known is at virtually the same time, a North Korean commando team tried to assault the South Korean Blue House, that is the Korean equivalent of the White House. Kind of a serious matter, all things considered. Then President Lyndon Johnson elected not only not to retaliate for the seizure of the Pueblo, but he pressed then South Korean President Park also not to retaliate, and Park, frankly, was furious. The South Korean executive mansion had been physically assaulted, and the Americans, which had a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, basically said, just sit on your hands and do nothing. In that already superheated environment, in April of 1969, North Korea shot down an American reconnaissance aircraft, killing 31 American airmen. President Nixon, who had taken office by then, did provide armed escorts for American reconnaissance craft after that, but he did not retaliate against North Korea. Indeed, he offered a drawdown, a partial withdrawal of American forces in South Korea, and quite famously began a normalization of relations with communist China. None of these steps sat very well with South Korea, which is why I emphasize these crises really were a crisis more between the United States and South Korea than they even were with the North. And the South Koreans resolved that if they could not count on the United States for protection, they would have to count on themselves. And they commenced a South Korean nuclear weapons program in the late 1960s. That development, in turn, convinced Kim Il-sung, still the leader of North Korea, that there might be a wedge, a rift developing between the United States and the South. And he then opened direct talks between North and South Korea that led to a joint declaration, kind of thumbing their nose at the Americans on July 4th, 1972, that both Koreas sought peaceful reunification. This was a reunification that at the time South Korea feared and North Korea hoped would trigger an immediate withdrawal of American forces from South Korea. Now that didn't happen, but the United States, which did get wind of South Korea's nuclear weapons program, did insist that South Korea halt all work on that nuclear weapons program, adhere to the International Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in exchange reaffirmed American nuclear protection of South Korea. Matters stood at that junction until the end of the Cold War in 1991. That was really bad news for North Korea. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, it ended, rather predictably, all assistance to North Korea. Communist China likewise reduced its economic assistance to North Korea, and that was doubly bad news for the North because through the 1980s, as the Cold War was eventually ending, the South Korean economy, for the first time, began to outpace the North. Let me emphasize that point. If we could get into a time machine and go back to the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, and ask just about any international relations analyst or economic analyst which Korea was performing better economically, they would have said without a shadow of a doubt, the North. It is not until a number of, well, really quite interesting developments that, alas, I haven't got time to go into, but related to the globalization of the world economy that permitted South Korea to, by the end of the 1980s, become the economic powerhouse that it remains today. But that was kind of a third kick in the teeth for North Korea. No aid from the Soviet Union, indeed no Soviet Union, no aid from, or reduced aid from China, and a South Korea that now had developed a more robust economy, and that meant a more attractive lifestyle than North Korea had. Well, in retrospect, the response of the North Koreans should have been obvious to everybody. The leaders of North Korea, still Kim Il-sung, began its own nuclear weapons program and began a missile program as well. Now, the United States and American intelligence analysts in Washington and elsewhere were not blind to that possibility. They very much wanted North Korea to agree to international nuclear inspections under the same body that has been responsible for such inspections throughout the post-war period, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, is what I'll refer to it. In the future, the United States wanted North Korea to agree to IAEA inspections, and controls on its nuclear reactors, and as well an end to North Korean missile exports, which were primarily going to the Middle East, which was an area of immediate concern for American foreign policy. Preliminary talks to this end began between the United States and North Korea the same year the Cold War ended, 1991, and the North made its position very clear. I'm going to emphasize the details of the position North Korea took in 1991 because they have not changed, right down to the present day. Here are the terms. The North insisted that in exchange for controls on its nuclear and missile programs, it wanted the armistice that had temporarily halted the fighting on the Korean Peninsula to be translated into a bilateral peace treaty between the United States and North Korea. That's not just a signature on a piece of paper. A peace treaty means one government recognizes the legitimacy of the other, which the United States still has not done in the case of North Korea. And the North Koreans said, you've got to do this first. We have to have a peace treaty between the United States and North Korea. Second term that the North Koreans insisted on in 1981, the United States must withdraw all nuclear weapons from South Korea. At the time, the United States did maintain nuclear weapons, although it didn't admit it to maintaining those. But that was the second North Korean term. And the third North Korean term was that the United States had to withdraw all American forces from South Korea and end military exercises that were held jointly between the American and South Korean militaries. Okay, those were the North Korean terms in 1991. And to obtain these ends, North Korea opened not just direct talks with the United States, but also opened direct talks with South Korea that led to where I began my talk today. The 1992 Joint Declaration of Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula signed between North and South Korea in 1992. Well, hopes were high in North Korea, in South Korea, in the United States, that the Korean mess might finally be sorted out, in no small part due to the end of the Cold War and what appeared to be this new, glorious new era where democracy was overtaking the world. It was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed. Liberal democratic capitalism had triumphed across the world, and the Korean problem was simply the last bit of bad news that would be taken care of by this. Alas, for Korea, hopes for any progress did not even last 1 year. In January of 1993, South Korea announced resumption of American South Korean military exercises. Infuriated, North Korea responded in March of 1993, just a couple of months later, that it would withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and would end cooperation with the IAEA. The United States responded by immediately agreeing to direct, that is bilateral, just the United States and North Korea, discussions. And these discussions, although preliminary, weren't formal, they weren't a summit conference, the head of states didn't meet, it was on a quite junior diplomatic level. But these preliminary meetings in 1993 infuriated three rather important groups that are still very much in play. First group that they infuriated were South Korean supporters of South Korean President Kim Jong-il, who had gambled on Korean rapprochement and now found himself cut off. I mean, the talks were between the United States and North Korea. He was furious that South Korea had not been consulted and had no representative present at those discussions. So South Korean leadership was furious at this development. South Korean conservatives on the right of the political spectrum, they were furious, arguing that both the United States and those Koreans that thought the United States was doing the right thing were being played for fools, that the North Koreans could not be trusted. They were simply going to engage in a long, fruitless set of negotiations with the United States in order to buy time to complete their nuclear program. This was all an elaborate ruse. And back on this side of the Pacific Ocean, Republicans in the United States argued exactly the same thing, said this is an exercise in foolery. The North Koreans are simply playing us. They simply want time to develop their own nuclear weapons program. Instead of talking with them, we should be engaged in preemptive military strikes against North Korea. And in this now rather superheated environment that didn't look very optimistic at all, in contrast to a year before, 1992, if you sought any guidance from the American public, well, this is what you would have heard. I'm going to say from a public opinion poll in November of 1993. Two-thirds of the American public supported military strikes on North Korea. Two-thirds of the American public opposed American involvement in any future Korean war. Be that as it may, by the start of 1994, there was a full-blown Korean crisis. North Korea is developing nuclear weapons. They already have been developing missiles. What ought we do about this? And in June of that year, the United States, South Korea, and Japan all requested UN sanctions be applied against North Korea, citing North Korea's non-compliance with the IAEA inspections. In response, North Korea threatened war against South Korea and anybody that came to its aid. It looked very much like there might be a war in 1994 until into this crisis flew, and I mean literally flew, former President Jimmy Carter, who went to North Korea, flew to North Korea as a private citizen and hammered out an agreement directly with the North Korean authorities, including Kim Il-sung. The deal that Carter hammered out, without American governmental sanction, completely on his own, was that North Korea would freeze its nuclear program, North Korea would allow IAEA inspections, and North Korea would immediately open talks with South Korea. In exchange for freezing the nuclear program, the United States and the West, South Korea and Japan, would table their motion for sanctions. They would be taken off consideration, and they would provide light water nuclear reactors to North Korea. And you might say, why in the world, if North Korea is working on a nuclear weapons program, would South Korea, Japan, and the United States offer nuclear reactors to the North? Well, this is a technical matter. I'm not an expert, but I will give you the Cliff Notes version. North Korea then was using Soviet-designed graphite reactors. It's relatively simple to use spent fuel from those reactors and refine it into nuclear weapons grade material. Okay. A light water reactor, it is much more difficult to develop nuclear weapons grade material from that. So the argument was, look, we know you North Koreans, you need energy. That's kind of a requisite to run any modern economy. We'll provide you with substitutes for the graphite reactors that you're using, and you will accept those substitutes because we like that and provide them basically cost-free, because it's going to make it much more difficult for you to develop nuclear weapons from those. So that was the deal that Carter hammered out. It looked like the United States, South Korea, Japan, and North Korea would all accept that agreement. The 1994 crisis over, but no. Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, finally died, and did so very shortly after the Carter Agreement had been signed. The South Korean government refused to offer condolences. Hey, this is the guy that attacked us back in 1950, and the new North Korean, Kim Jong Il, the founder's son, the current leader's father, was furious about this and said, well, deal's off. I'm not going to meet with South Korea if they're not even going to send condolences. But negotiations with the United States did go forward, resulting in the Agreed Framework, that was the actual title of it, used in late 1994. And the Agreed Framework, I'll give you the details of it, but essentially it was Carter's deal, right? That there would be no sanctions, that the United States, South Korea, and Japan would provide light water reactors and fuel oil, economic aid to North Korea. The United States would open a liaison office, right? Not formal diplomatic relations, but the functional equivalent to that with North Korea. And in exchange, North Korea would dispose of its spent nuclear fuel. It would move to reopen IAEA inspections. It would dismantle its graphite reactors as soon as the light water reactors became operational. And it would ratify the non-proliferation treaties, which in fact it did in 1995. Now, it's clear in retrospect, although it certainly was not to anybody alive and following this at the time, that the West was not entirely dealing in good faith with the North Koreans. It did so because it seemed so obvious at the time that it wouldn't have to. There's a very famous satellite photograph that was taken in 1994 at night It shows China, you can make it out quite clearly with all the cities lit up. South Korea is a virtual beacon of electricity, and there's this great dark area in between. It's called North Korea. North Korea really did have an energy crisis, and it had a lot more than that. It had mass famine in 1994, and just about everybody was convinced this is it. The North Korean regime is going to collapse. It's going to collapse long before we have to deliver those light water reactors or anything like that. And this agreed framework is really a nice way for us to buy time until North Korea collapses, so we're not giving up very much. Things might have played out that way. We don't know. Obviously, they didn't play out that way. The North Korean regime is still very much with us in 2018, but we never got a chance to see if the agreed framework would play out or not, because there were elections for Congress in November of 1994, and those of us, which probably comprise everybody in this room, I always have to remember I'm not talking to college students anymore, might recall that 1994 was the big shocker of the Clinton years when the Republicans seized control of both houses of Congress. And they remember what they had said about North Korea, and they said this is a bad deal. This agreed framework, the North Koreans are just playing us. And they attempted to suspend fuel oil shipments to the North. They tried to block American support for the light water reactors, and in any case, they absolutely shut down the opening of any liaison office between the United States and North Korea. And as you might recall, that was one of the three keys the North Koreans have always insisted on, right? I mean, formal relations, the road to formal relations with the United States. The agreed framework basically was crippled from its beginning. It limped on for about 4 more years when there were 4 power talks, the Koreas joined by the United States and China, that began in Geneva, Switzerland in December of 1997. And swiftly went nowhere because North Korea, I'm going to ask you to pay attention again, demanded, as a prerequisite to those talks proceeding, a peace treaty between itself and the United States, and the withdrawal of American forces, all American forces, from South Korea. Talks went nowhere. And indeed, the agreed framework collapsed pretty much of its own accord that same year because of the Asian financial crisis began in Thailand, for those of you remember all this stuff, and very quickly spread to Taiwan, Korea, and almost brought down into Japan as well. In any event, South Korea had to stop its economic aid to North Korea. The North Koreans said, well, just about every piece of the agreed framework has now been shattered, and has been shattered by our adversaries. So, in August of 1998, they launched a missile from North Korea that passed over Japan, put a thorough scare into the Japanese, and infuriated the Republicans in Congress that said, see, we were right all along. The North Koreans have been playing us for fools, and it is time to move to overthrow the regime in North Korea, to blockade by naval force if necessary the exports of missiles from North Korea. Well, they didn't do that because Bill Clinton was still president, but they did succeed in completely shutting off American fuel oil shipments, the very last component of the agreed framework of 4 years earlier. President Clinton did try to revive talks between the United States and North Korea in the last months of his presidency. You might recall, I'm sure you recall, that the majority of Clinton's second term was consumed by something called the Lewinsky affair. Clinton tried to make a last bid for peace in 2000. He did send Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to North Korea in October of that year with a gift of a basketball signed by Michael Jordan. Somehow basketball players come into this at very improbable moments. And Kim Jong Il offered that he would stop North Korea's long-range missile program, but he wanted sanctions lifted and economic aid resumed. Bill Clinton thought that he was not in a position, since it was October of 2000, he was virtually a lame duck president, to make a deal on that basis. He approached both candidates, Al Gore, his vice president, who was running for president on the Democratic ticket, and George W. Bush, running on the Republican ticket, and said, are you interested in doing this? And they kind of looked at him and said, are you kidding? I mean, we really want to look like softies on North Korea when we're running for president? This is not in the cards. And so this last initiative of Clinton's went absolutely nowhere. As I'm sure you all recall from Florida and Haines and all that business, George W. Bush was elected President of the United States by a vote of 5-4 on the American Supreme Court. Well, the incoming Bush administration viewed North Korea as an odious, thoroughly odious regime, the last relic of the Cold War. George W. Bush personally despised Kim, thought he was an evil man who starved his own people. He made his hatred obvious even before his January 2002 State of the Union address, which referred to this axis of evil, pretty strong terms, including Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Well, Kim Jong Il responded rather predictably. He said, well, if you're going to consider me this way, I might have to resume my nuclear and missile programs. And he demanded resumption of economic aid and those light water reactors and the withdrawal of American forces from South Korea, or else he would resume nuclear and missile programs. Well, these threats reignited the crisis almost as bad as 1994. South Korean President Kim Dae-jung literally flew to Washington, D.C. saying, look, I know you don't like these North Korean guys, but you got to sit down and talk with them, because if there is a second Korean War, we're going to be the guys who pay for it, not you Americans. And Bush was completely unmoved and said, no, we're not dealing with evil dictators like Kim, but I'll be happy to offer you an anti-ballistic missile system, so that when you see the North Korean missiles coming in, you can attempt to shoot them down. In his State of the Union address a year later, Bush explicitly endorsed preemptive war, which of course he began against Iraq soon after that, but you can only imagine what the North Koreans made of this particular pronouncement. And privately, Bush said, North Korea ought to be overthrown. We really ought to get rid of that regime. Well, the North Koreans were not privy to Bush's private statements, but they certainly did understand that he didn't like them very much. And they saw those statements as violations of all the previous agreements, 1992, 1994, 2000, of bad faith by the United States. And so it noted in late 2002 that it had resumed its nuclear weapons program. The Bush administration demanded an immediate halt. It ended fuel oil deliveries, and it withdrew from the light water reactor program formally. Bush declared that the United States had all options on the table in dealing with this new North Korean crisis, which sounds like a broken record, but this thoroughly alarmed the South Koreans. And the new South Korean president, Roh Moo-hyun, deeply alarmed and said, look, so far as South Korea is concerned, we'd rather have a nuclear North Korea that had developed nuclear weapons, in preference to a collapsed North Korea or a second Korean War. I mean, if we really have to choose between these things, we'll accept a nuclear-armed North. Meanwhile, the Democrats in the United States blasted Bush for doing nothing about North Korea. You should have bombed these guys. And going to war with Iraq, which, as it of course turned out, did not have nuclear weapons. Indeed, a month after the United States invaded Iraq, North Korea declared that it had already built nuclear weapons and would never dismantle them, and revoked its earlier adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Whereupon John Bolton, yes, that John Bolton, declared that any discussions with North Korea were useless, and after China tried to revive talks, Bush named Bolton head of any American delegation that would attend those talks, and North Korea said, this is a guy that's openly said he wants our regime overthrown. We're not going to sit down and talk with this guy. There's no prospect of conference with the Bolton or people like that. And into this already heated environment, congressional Republicans introduced the North Korean Human Rights Act, which Bush signed in October of 2004. The act was to encourage and fund defections of North Koreans, and to encourage and fund resistance organizations that they might form in North Korea or elsewhere. These actions, my broken record again, deeply alarmed the South Koreans. And indeed, we have public opinion polls from South Korea that state quite clearly that the majority of South Koreans consider the United States the single largest threat to South Korean security. Not North Korea, the United States. Into that environment, Bush was reelected, but by 2005, he was not quite so cocky toward North Korea as he'd been, because Iraq, after all, had turned into not this instant victory where American soldiers were going to be welcomed with open arms and Iraq was going to be turned into this exemplar of democracy for the Middle East. No, that had not happened in Iraq. The United States had been badly bogged down there, and hopes to shock and awe North Korea, they're no longer on the table by 2005. And Bush's new Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, signaled as much and said, okay, we're willing to come to the table and talk with the North Koreans. We're going to insist that North Korea has to give up its nuclear weapons, but, and this was a new development for the Bush administration, not until it had new nuclear reactors. The United States promised it would not attack North Korea. It would revive energy aid for North Korea. In fact, it would return to the 1994 Agreed Framework that the Republicans had so vehemently denounced about 10 years earlier. The problem was one of timing. North Korea said, you lift your measures against us first, then we'll think about giving up our nuclear weapons. And to emphasize that point, it began a fresh round of nuclear and missile tests in the summer and fall of 2006. That, in turn, led not to the reopening of discussions between the United States and North Korea, but to the United States and South Korea and Japan going back to the United States, and this time getting sanctions applied against North Korea that kicked in late 2006. North Korea might have ridden out those sanctions, but got unlucky. There was a massive typhoon, Pacific hurricane that hit, and the North Koreans agreed to come back to the peace table, and indeed a new agreement that kind of looked like the 1994 Agreed Framework was signed in 2007, and it did not last even a year. The United States insisted on nuclear inspections first. North Korea said no, lift the sanctions first. The South Koreans had presidential elections of their own. The new South Korean leader was hostile to economic assistance. He didn't want to go back to the Agreed Framework of 1994. And Kim Jong Il suffered a stroke, almost like predicted. The 1994 agreement is signed and sung. He got sick. Kim Jong Il now gets sick. He suffers a stroke in August of 2008 and begins to prepare the way for his son, Kim Jong-un, the current leader, to take power. And again, Western intelligence analysts are pretty much unified in when they looked upon the situation and said, look, this new guy, this Kim Jong-il guy, Kim Jong-un, he's not even 30 years old. He's untested and virtually unknown. The only way he's going to be able to stay in power is through a foreign policy based on provocation and, above all, of making sure that North Korea achieves substantial nuclear and missile capabilities. It's into that environment that Barack Obama becomes president of the United States. And when you take a look at Obama's Korea policy, it's a bit puzzling now because you have to look pretty hard for it. If you take a look, for example, in Bob Woodward's long study, and otherwise a quite engaging book, Obama's Wars, what strikes me is there is not a single index entry on Korea in that, not one, for the entirety of Obama's term. But if you take a look at the broader record, what Obama was actually doing, it is, alas, I have no news for you. It's a rerun of the story that I've already been telling. When he takes office in 2009, North Korea is already conducting nuclear and missile tests. Obama refuses to consider opening talks directly with the North Koreans. North Korea says, well, in that case, we will resume nuclear testing. Obama then reverts to a hard line and says, okay, we're going to tighten sanctions still more. When a new famine hits North Korea in 2011, Obama steps back and says, well, are you interested now in Western economic aid? And North Korea says, sure, we're interested. And Obama says, well, in that case, I need some progress on the nuclear front. And North Korea says, no, we need the aid first. And when they don't get it, they, starting to sound really familiar by now, they resume nuclear and missile testing. In 2015, after the conclusion of the U.S.-Iran nuclear agreement that Trump just scratched, Obama signaled one more time that he would be willing to agree to direct negotiations between the United States and North Korea without North Korea first denuclearizing. But, and I'm going to say this just one more time, North Korea said, first, we have to have a peace treaty, and we have to have American forces out of South Korea. And the United States' response was to conduct joint exercises between the United States and South Korea in 2016, the ones that Trump canceled for this year, where not only were those exercises held under Obama, but the United States test-fired 2 American ICBMs to say, we can reach out and touch you anytime we want. Very hard-nosed response by the Obama administration. But the North Koreans were not impressed. In July of 2016, an official North Korean statement said, look, we'll agree to denuclearization if, I'm sure you're tired of it by now, if there's a formal peace treaty. If all of Korea and its vicinity are denuclearized, that is, South Korea, no nukes in South Korea, and oh, here's the interesting part, its vicinity. No American nuclear weapons anywhere near any part of Korea. And yes, that includes Japan, incidentally. And this American threat must be removed before North Korea gets rid of, or even thinks about getting rid of, its nuclear weapons. And oh, by the way, just to make sure the Americans don't cheat, the North Koreans insisted on North Korea's right to inspect American facilities in South Korea, if any remained. The Americans didn't go for this deal, and now to really approach the present, I'm going to read off a rather painful litany of North Korean steps on, what else, July 4th, 2017, North Korea launched an ICBM of its own that was capable of reaching Chicago. In September of 2017, North Korea tested a nuclear warhead small enough to mount on an ICBM, rather significant development. In October of 2017, most, though not all, experts believe North Korea tested a hydrogen bomb, and in November of 2017, North Korea tested an ICBM capable, alas, of reaching New York City, though I don't think it can get to Southampton. At least not quite yet. Well, that prompted a new crisis between the United States and North Korea, and a lot of angry words out of the White House from President Trump about all options on the table, and the United States can reach out and touch North Korea when it wishes. The problem was that many experts, even within the American military, point out that the military option really is unthinkable. That regime change is really quite unrealistic. That under any scenario you might wish to war game out, you lead to, at best, hundreds of thousands of casualties on the Korean Peninsula that would include American citizens, a substantial number of which live in South Korea. And if indeed a military option is not on the table, a better idea, at least some analysts, I confess this is a minority opinion among analysts, but some analysts were arguing by late 2017 that instead of regime change, a better move would be to go toward a changed regime in North Korea, one that could be changed by American and South Korean, let's call them what they are, concessions. That the United States finally should extend precisely the security guarantees that North Korea has been requesting for decades, that the United States should finally establish formal diplomatic relations between itself and North Korea, that the United States should end American South Korean military exercises, and the United States should cooperate in international help for developing North Korean energy needs without graphite or ideally any nuclear reactors. As for missiles, as opposed to the nuclear problem, these scholars argue it's time just to get used to them and point out that, well, they're missiles. North Korea wants a satellite program. It wants to be able to launch its own satellites and have a satellite system in space for things like cell phones and other sorts of things. And there's not been another incident in the history of humankind where a sovereign nation was denied the ability, the sovereign right, if you will, to launch rockets into orbit. And it's not, of course, just the United States or Russia or the European Union that do so. India, Iran, Israel, I mean, they all do so. It seems a little bizarre to insist that North Korea alone give up that right. Well, this is an alternate program that some elements of the academic community were discussing at the end of 2017, and it's possible that President Trump has actually paid attention to these elements, has embraced the change regime argument. It's even possible that it's been sold to Trump, and this strikes me as entirely plausible, that a grand opening of American relations to North Korea would be viewed by historians as something as spectacular as Nixon's visit to China in 1972, something that gets you in the history books. And for Trump, I mean, that's catnip. I mean, that's stuff that really can appeal to him. Very high theater. So it's plausible. It's a plausible scenario. And while concessions from the United States along the lines of this changed regime program that I briefly outlined here might offer a way forward, might be a strategy for the long term, there are a number of immediate problems. At the top of the list are Trump's atrocious tactics. His diplomacy is not his strong point. He's a great showman. He can tweet with the best of them. But long-term strategizing and implementing tactics to get there, I'm not inclined to give him a very good grade, at least not currently. Here's why. The Singapore summit statement was exceedingly vague on the whole denuclearization issue. The timing, the steps to be taken, the nature of them, and so forth. That's one problem. It says nothing about North Korean chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear proliferation. Can North Korea export nuclear technology? It says nothing about those. And of course it says nothing about missiles either. Trump has argued since the summit that he has, and he really kind of challenged Joe McCarthy here, 300 sanctions. I have in my hand 157 members of the Communist Party. Right? Trump's got 300 sanctions yet to be deployed. This is errant nonsense. Right? Under the best of circumstances, tightening sanctions in North Korea will absolutely require Chinese and Russian cooperation. And in the UN, China and Russia are certain to veto a tightening of sanctions. And who could blame them? You want Chinese cooperation on the North Korean issue, so of course you impose $50 billion worth of tariff penalties against China. This is a great way to induce cooperation from a key partner in the North Korean issue. Right? You go to a summit conference in Singapore and, gee, South Korea is not there. They feel a bit left out about this. At that conference, you signal that North Korean ICBMs that are capable of reaching the United States are unacceptable, but shorter-range missiles that can reach South Korea and Japan, well, the Americans might be able to live with those. Oh, and did I mention the trade war with China? And Trump signals that, well, ZTE, oh, that's a special corporation, I'll back down in that cases, and instead we'll give American concessions. This gives a rather interesting signal to Chinese negotiators about just how astute Trump is in carrying these things out. Same thing on Trump's threats, which he made in March of this year, to withdraw American troops from South Korea unless South Korea offers trade concessions. I can't think of a better calculated strategy to tear apart the understanding between the United States and South Korea that has been built up since South Korea's founding. And this really scary part is, I'm not sure the president even knows that he's dismantling this relationship. I don't know that he sees the connections between the two. If you really want to engage in changed regime in North Korea and convince them that signing an agreement, especially over nuclear issues with the United States, is a good idea, the last thing you want to do is tear up the U.S.-Iran deal. But that's exactly what Trump has done. Or even, something that's not paid a great deal of attention to, withdrawing the nomination of Victor Cha for ambassador, the United States ambassador to South Korea. Victor Cha is not exactly a softie. He has been at the forefront of saying we've got to screw the sanctions on tighter and tighter because North Korea is essentially an odious regime. And that wasn't odious enough for Trump, at least a few weeks before the Singapore summit. Of course, with Trump, you never know. Odd days, he says one thing, he says another. But Victor Cha, hardline, his nomination was withdrawn, and for those of you that keep track of these things, the current U.S. nominee for South Korean ambassador is Admiral Harry Harris, who has made no secret that he's of the John Bolton strike, bombs away. And you name him as your ambassador, and you want to engage in serious discussions with North Korea, you really wonder what kind of signals you're sending to the North. I'd close by asking you to put yourself, as something I've been implicitly doing this evening, in the shoes of Kim Jong-un. What does he want? What does he want from this entire process? And I would submit to you that the top priority for Kim Jong-un has nothing to do with the United States and nothing immediately to do with even South Korea. I think it has a great deal to do with North Korean relations with China. The way things stand with an isolated North Korea, North Korea essentially lives hand-to-mouth by the sufferance of the Chinese. That is a dependence that no sovereign leader could long tolerate, but it is a dependence that Kim Jong-un must live with day to day. China can open the spigot, it can close the spigot, and the fate of his regime depends upon that. Now, if I were Kim Jong-un, my top priority would be to do whatever I can do to get North Korea back in play internationally, to get leverage over the Chinese, to reduce the amount of leverage they have over me. And the Singapore summit, well, that was a beautiful start to exactly that kind of arrangement. If North Korea can successfully court the United States, South Korea, Russia, Japan, that would be a monumental change in North Korea's standing with China. And indeed, Kim Jong-un even might think that he can present himself as a very natural partner with the United States in reducing China's overall and growing influence in East Asia and elsewhere, if only the Americans can overcome the heavy hand of, I dare say, history in dealing with North Korea. Indeed, as some scholars point out, why are we so exercised about ICBMs from North Korea when we have lived with those from China since the mid-1960s? And for those of you saying, well, but Kim Jong-un, he's this young guy, he's kind of crazy. I would remind you about American perceptions of this other guy called Mao Zedong, leader of communist China in the 1960s, when Mao was basically saying, hey, look, let's go have a nuclear war. We've got plenty of Chinese. We'll survive it. You probably won't. I mean, that's a much more dangerous statement than any leader of North Korea ever made. So, all due respect to President Trump, I don't see Kim Jong-un as a little rocket man. I see him as an eminently rational individual pursuing rational foreign policy objectives. I don't know if the United States has figured this out or not, but I strongly doubt it, because the initial approach by, yes, John Bolton and Secretary of State Pompeo has been to cite, well, denuclearization first is a good idea, just like Libya. Where Libya, for those you might recall, Muammar Gaddafi gave up a Libyan nuclear weapons program that was not as far advanced as North Korea's, to be sure, but he gave it up, and the price he paid was his life and his regime's existence. The only other, although this is not popularly mentioned, the only other government I can think of that voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees was the Ukraine. I mean, Soviet Union-era weapons were stationed on Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian government became independent, agreed to give those up in exchange for Western security guarantees. Last I looked, Ukraine was having certain security problems that the West has not done a great deal to help Ukraine out of. So if I'm Kim Jong-il, I'm looking at Libya, I'm looking at Ukraine, and I'm looking at a bunch of crazy people in the White House, and I'm saying, I really wish these guys would wake up and do something rational, but with the Americans, you just can't be sure. Thank you very much. As ever,
would you take some questions?
Happy to take questions. Yes?
Yeah, in Henry Kissinger's book on China, he sort of refers to China's foreign policy as a triple act. In other words, China will get into international conflict when their own borders are threatened. So you've got China now expanding up its Spratly Islands, bringing Korea essentially under the umbrella of Chinese influence greater than it was before. My view is that China is the big player here, the big one, and Korea is a minor part of the whole chess game that China is playing. And no matter what, little Kim does, it really doesn't matter in terms of Chinese foreign policy to increase their influence over these areas.
I think that may well be true, but I think if you're the United States, you take allies when allies might be too strong a term, but you take enemy of my enemy is my friend, where you can find them. I vividly recall, all these arguments being made in the case of Vietnam, where, North Vietnam was, the eternal enemy of the United States, that it was a pawn of China, and lo and behold, once the Vietnam War ended, the next war that broke out in Southeast Asia was between Vietnam and China. Well, sometimes you got to be a Henry Kissinger and say, please look at the chessboard and get rid of some of your blinders. Yeah, it's a good point.
No, that was great. Thank you very much. Is it possible, as a historian, to speculate on the likely evolution of this horrible situation in which we find ourselves? At least, and I mentioned this before, we're not threatening to bomb North Korea, and they seem to have eased up on their threats for the time being. So there's a little good that's come out of this. But how are things likely to evolve?
Well, I would simply refer back to the question that Henry Kissinger actually put to Zhou Enlai during the 1972 normalization discussions. He asked, just in formal dinner conversation, he asked Zhou what he thought of the French Revolution of 1789, and Zhou said, too soon to tell. Which I thought was just an absolutely splendid answer. As an historian, I always keep that story at hand. But now, to attempt something serious, I have to say, if we had a George H.W. Bush in the White House, if we had a Dwight Eisenhower in the White House, just to name two, I feel relatively confident that sober heads would prevail, and there would be, most conservatively, a return to the agreed framework of 1994, or something that would look like something along those lines, or ideally a realization of what that agreed framework promised, which was a normalization of relations between the United States and North Korea, because my sense is, it's always good to know other people a little better. Diplomatic relations, that's what diplomats do. It's a pretty good idea to let them talk to each other. But with Trump, you have no idea. It's completely impossible to say what's going to happen from one day to the next. The most startling thing to me so far out of the whole Trump presidency was the Comey revelations that you might recall from the Stephanopoulos, the long interview, not just the parts that were aired on 60 Minutes. And what kind of blew Comey away, and I'll reserve comments about Comey because it's kind of a complicated situation, but what blew me away was when Comey said that he came in and gave the initial briefing to President Trump about possible Russian interference in the American electoral process. And the immediate reaction of Trump and his advisors was, how can we use this to best advantage? Not, is this true or not? Not, what do we do about this violation of American sovereignty, but how can we use this bit of information to enhance our own situation? These are people that live, forget day to day. It's tweet to tweet. And under those circumstances, I really find it impossible to figure out. I carried, there's been a ton of literature just produced last week on the Korean situation, and one of my favorite ones, which is 2 weeks old, I must confess, starts, from the beginning, the summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un was slated to be a strange event, but now that it's been canceled, well, who knows? We could be in a Holocaust next week, or we could have a breakthrough next week, or we could be in next week and have neither.
If, let's assume that the U.S. signs a peace treaty with North Korea. There are no U.S. nuclear weapons in South Korea. Do you think North Korea would actually give up its nuclear weapons?
I think the North Koreans would and still are adhering to their core set of terms. They want not just a peace treaty, which means formal American diplomatic recognition of their regime, but they want assurances that the Korean Peninsula and its vicinity don't have nuclear weapons any longer. They want American forces out of South Korea, and they want economic assistance. So I think their position is pretty clear, and if you want to deliver on all this account, and if you find it politically feasible to deliver, that's a problem. I recall right after the summit, the Democrats, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi came out and said, oh, Trump he's giving away the farm to the North Koreans. I mean, both parties play this game. I mean, the other guys are softies, and they're giving up. That's not a full answer to your question, but I think it's the best one that I can offer.
I think Kim Jong-un, because he was educated in Western countries, so he's seen Western economies, prosperity, and he realizes what's on the other side, which this country hasn't enjoyed. He's achieved, I think, maximum leverage because he's developed a nuclear weapon that he can bring to the table. President Trump, on the other hand, he has maximum leverage, and I think he's the first American president that has had the guts to actually use it, and that is using China, which you alluded to.
Could you
China
speak a little
props up-
louder? I can't really hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm saying, in terms of leverage, bringing leverage to the negotiating table, Kim Jong-un has maximum leverage because he's developed a nuclear weapon. On our side, Trump has maximum leverage because he's the first president to actually use China and our financial pressure on China. We have a tremendous trade imbalance with China, and China knows it, and I think that's what Trump and the Republicans are using now as leverage. And I'll just in closing say that Trump was the first president that had the guts to meet face to face with. All previous presidents were told, you can't meet with a small, bad, evil dictator. It doesn't look right. What if you fail? But he was willing to take that risk, so I give him a lot of credit for it. And I think his prospects to succeed are much, much better.
Well, we'll see.
Well,
Yes.
I have to say, I give Trump no credit for anything. I feel that he just gave away the farm, and they're using the propaganda photo of all over North Korea now. He's bowed down to this guy, and we have no leverage now. I think it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. We got nothing out of it. All he did was give Kim recognition, and China's running away with everything.
I think we can all agree President Trump stirs strong passions on all sides.
If year after year, and it was quite repetitive how you said it, that what the main thing that North Korea wants is the recognition from the United States. What is the downside? I mean, obviously there's some major downside because this, after that, year after year after year, that's what they want, and we refuse to do that. So from your perspective, why is that so important, that we do or do not do that?
The big political downside is political. If you want to normalize relations with North Korea, you're going to have to accept two rather important things. You're going to have to accept a nuclear North Korea, because let's face it, North Korea can say, we will completely denuclearize. North Korea can say, we will agree to IAEA inspections. North Korea, in fact, can agree to everything Iran agreed to before Trump tore up the agreement. And there'd still be no effective way for the United States to verify that North Korea has no nuclear weapons. That it's bigger than the state of Pennsylvania. There is no way, right? I don't know what Pompeo is smoking. There is no way we can get irrevocable verification of zero nuclear weapons capability in North Korea. And even if we could, you can't turn the clock back on knowledge. Right? They know how to build these things. They can be built a little slower than the Erector set, but not much slower than the Erector set. I'm sure all this generation knows Erector sets. That's just not in the ballpark. You're going to have to accept a nuclear North Korea, and you're going to have to accept a North Korea capable of building ICBMs. I mean, that's a pretty big downside, because any agreement you sign, this goes back to the guts issue, any agreement you sign, what are you going to do? Are you going to submit that to the United States Senate as a formal treaty for ratification? You're going to be crucified. I don't care who you are, George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, Dwight Eisenhower, or Donald Trump. There is going to be holy hell raised in the United States Senate. The only other way you can do that is by an executive agreement.
So at this point, you don't feel that there's any way to denuclearize?
There would have to be a sea change in American politics. That's my judgment.
To the North Koreans, is the area of denuclearization include things like missile silos in Utah and subs floating around the Pacific?
Well, presumably, these are details that haven't been hashed out, but I presume they mean what they said. The North Koreans mean what they say when they say vicinity of Korea, which certainly would include Japan, but American Trident submarines off the coast of North Korea. I don't see that as verifiable either. So besides, you're going to have to really kind of recognize reality in this case.
From an economic standpoint, what do the Koreans have to export? And the scary part is they can export the nuclear technology and the ICBM technology, and that's all they've got. So that's even more important. But also, I understand, if I'm not incorrect in this, please tell me, that the president of South Korea is an ex-attorney, human rights attorney, and he has become the head of the South Korea, partly to initiate talks with the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very important thing that we really haven't told.
No, we haven't. And another thing lurking not too far in the background is your central point about economics is Kim Jong-un serious about reunification?
Under what terms?
Well, yes, under what terms? What would be the attractiveness? If he comes to the conclusion that North Korea is no longer a viable economic experiment, and there have been inklings under his father, where there were moves toward reforms. There have been moves recently toward market-style reforms in North Korea. I'm sure that Kim, being educated in the West, is entirely familiar with what happened in East Germany and Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War. And if I have no channel to the man, if he believes that the regime is not viable in the long run, then the logical thing to do is essentially what he seems to be doing on the surface of it, and that is opening discussions with the United States and with South Korea, and being quite serious on eventual reunification, which would solve an awful lot of problems. But for now, that seems pie in the sky, I must say.
I just want to point out, somebody said that the United States doesn't have nukes, but the United States has nukes on ships and submarines off the coast of South Korea, and they're aimed at North Korea. And the United States had nukes in South Korea until George H.W. Bush pulled them out. So North Korea does feel under siege. Let's be very clear about that. But the other thing is what this gentleman mentioned, that I think that the single most important actor in allowing this breakthrough was Moon Jae-in, the first Prime Minister of South Korea. His predecessor would never have done this. This would not have happened if his predecessor was still in power. He's the man, I think, who deserves a Nobel Peace Prize if something really comes of these things. But he was the matchmaker that brought these two sides together.
And let's not forget the South Korean conservatives are still out there too. They have their own elections. There are political issues that the South Koreans are going to have to confront to get any movement on any of these issues.
One thing that hasn't been discussed at this point is the conventional power that North Korea has in place at this particular point with their artillery circling Seoul, upwards to 15,000 traditional artillery business. That has been kept at bay by, and of course, some stories about very substantial tunnels under their portion of the DMZ, so they can pop up like gophers, right inside of the soul. The point would be that conventional capability, of course, would be something that you want to negotiate away, and that's something the two Koreas could handle. But if they do not, the only thing keeping that South Korea viable is the presence of the 30,000 American troops that are there, the tripwire, so to speak. Is there any thought somewhere in somebody's mind, that in our strategic command, whatever, that North Korea at one time could still invade the South?
I'm not privy to current classified information, but I would be totally amazed if there were not contingency plans. And indeed, that the American military was deeply shocked at President Trump's cancellation of the joint exercises for 2018 that permit the local commanders to become familiar with those contingency plans. If I may, I'm going to riff off your one of the points you raised to introduce yet another political consideration. Look, if Kim Jong-un is serious about long-term reform, one of the things he's going to have to do is reduce North Korean defense spending. And I think he's got a real problem on that, and it's certainly one that Americans can sympathize with. You know, American defense spending has not exactly gone down since the end of the Cold War. It's very difficult for some of the political reasons I mentioned earlier to actually cut. I don't mean increase by less, I mean actually reduce defense spending. I think Kim Jong-un faces that problem in spades. And I think one of his primary considerations in coming to power was to attempt to reduce the political power of the North Korean military inside the North Korean regime. And there were a number of strategic assassinations that took place in North Korea that analysts speculate, and I'm far from my comfort zone as a historian here, speculate were efforts by Kim to try to get a handle on the power of the North Korean military. Well, he's going to have to do a terrific job of doing that if indeed he wants to himself proceed in normalization of relations with South Korea and with the United States. So I mean, that's one more monkey wrench into the gears.
It seems that, I give it, nothing of this agreement, you don't have all the details, it's not ironed out. What's the alternative if there's no attempt at making an agreement? I mean, you have what you had, you worried about these missiles, these bombs, being able to hit New York. Okay, so that's okay, but to try to make an agreement is not? To go after and try to reconcile, to make some sort of headway with this man, is not a joke the way most people seem to, be taking this president and what they're doing, what they're trying to do. I think that the alternative is, okay, then we live with the way we live right now, not knowing about him, about Kim, so what's the alternative to that? What's your answer to that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can kick the can down the road a little bit further. You can try for full normalization, or you can do the John Bolton and see, how many dominoes fall.
How about one more?
In the context of vicinity of North Korea, would you say China is within that area?
Certainly.
So, you think anyone would twist China's arms and say, move your weapons?
On the contrary, I'm quite convinced that the People's Liberation Army of China has its own contingency plans that involve operations on the Korean Peninsula. And not necessarily in response to an American attack on the North, either.